Welcome to the Propertybuyer Podcast, where we explore the world of residential and commercial real estate to help you make better decisions about buying, selling, or investing in all types of property. Join me, Rich Harvey, CEO of propertybuyer.com.au and multi-award-winning buyer's advocate. Our podcast features expert interviews, market trends and insights, and practical tips for navigating the complex world of Australian real estate. Whether you're a home buyer, a seasoned property investor, commercial buyer, developer, or simply curious about the property market, our podcast is for you. Join us as we share our knowledge, strategies and experience and help you achieve your property goals. Welcome to another edition of the Propertybuyer Podcast, and in this episode we'll be looking at how you can use data and artificial intelligence, AI, to make better property decisions. Today we're surrounded by a plethora of data providers, yet how do we decide which sources of data are accurate? And how should we interpret the data that we're seeing? It's really important to get real-time data versus just looking at historical data so you can make present-day decisions about property investment or even buying a home. To help us unpack everything in this mysterious data world, we have no one better than Luke Metcalfe, data scientist and founder of MICROBURBS. Welcome, Luke.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me, Rich.
Pleasure. So, Luke, we have a tradition on our podcast, and I've thrown this one. It's a bit of a curveball too. You didn't know this was coming. It's a statistical one. It's a thought by Charles Swindoll, who says, life is 10% what happens to be, 90% how I react to it. What do you take from that thought?
Yeah. So obviously, a lot of people sit on the fence when it comes to buying a property. And there's a whole lot of people that have the FOMO and they are sitting on the sidelines and they regret not buying when their friend did. So obviously you need to take responsibility for yourself in your property purchasing decisions and don't be someone who could see that there was a great opportunity and miss it.
Yeah, perfect. Absolutely. I think a lot of people blame the market, they blame their circumstances for not being able to buy. But at the end of the day, you know, we're all born with nothing, we leave with nothing, so it is how you react to it. So Luke, I've got a couple of questions. What sort of created your fascination with property and data and what sparked your interest in the property market?
Yeah, I'm going to wind the clock back to the age of 5.
Yeah.
This is a bit weird. So my dad bought me a computer and I got obsessed with programming.
Excellent.
There were simple little chatbots, but the thing that really excited me was that I could get more out of it than what I put in. So the simple code that I wrote, more came back. So people believed these little chatbots were alive, even though they obviously weren't. And then fast forward to the 1990s. So I'm making little applications and things, but I really got into data analysis because out of that, I could learn things that no one else knew. So there were amazing insights. So my first job during the dot-com boom, I was able to mine the data and know things that the marketing lady didn't know. And then fast forward again to today, obviously this is a really important question. So it's the biggest decision people make in their lives, where they live. So it's a very rich problem. So I love that I can bring in, what I really love to do, what I'm passionate about is bringing in data from many sources. So trying to get a full picture. So if you're trying to model human decision making, there's actually a lot that goes into it. You can't have simple rules. You can't do it all on a spreadsheet. So taking into account, lifestyle and amenity and market information, demographics, finances, all these things coming together. For me, that comes back to that magic that I felt when I was 5, which is like, wow, this code feels like it's alive. And then an extra dimension is like not only what property is suitable for the person, but then the hardest thing of all, which is what does the future hold? So if data doesn't know all the answers by any means, but to be able to reliably run an algorithm that can predict the future is a pretty magical thing.
Awesome, I love it. There's like a synergy that comes from the data analysis. It's like you extract more information to help you move forward. I love that. So, I mean, I trained as an economist, as you know, in my background, and I was fascinated by how the economy works, how the world works, and that's why I did it. And there's always a joke about economists, and they know how everything works. They just assume it. They just make assumptions, to work out their models, right?
Yeah. So I definitely pay attention to economic models. I'm not an economist, but it's one of those things that comes up. So obviously supply and demand are the simplest level. Yeah, I think that kind of curiosity that you get from an economics degree that opens you up to all different ways of thinking, I think that puts you in great stead as a buyer's agent.
You just made a really good point, way of thinking. I mean, I did econometrics and economics. I did a master's as well, but econometrics I found fascinating because it's these models, it's these constructs of how human behaviour, how consumers think and behave. And it's not perfect, but it is a model and it does show you generally what might happen. And no model is perfect, but I do think it does create a general direction, a general synergy of what's going to happen.
Yeah, so, your audience may not know, but econometrics is like the smart man's economics.
Exactly.
And it's actually concerned with causation, which is very hard. So very often I don't know. I just know that one thing is a leading indicator of another, and maybe that's enough. But to actually concern yourself with what causes what, people may not appreciate that that's a harder problem than it might seem when you're talking to your mates at the barbecue.
So tell me about MICROBURBS. You set up MICROBURBS. Why did you set it up and what's it all about? What kind of benefits does it provide to the average person?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you've got these subjective sort of suburb reviews, yeah? So the picture that's painted by the real estate agent or by people who live in the area, you've got your brand suburbs like Glebe and Newtown and St Kilda and Bondi and Fortitude Valley and Cottesloe. That one thing was that you had these big brand suburbs. I felt like most of the country is being neglected. Yeah, you don't have the same stories being told about them. And then you had like raw sort of data providers. Yeah, typically talking at a very aggregate level. So they're talking about like what's the outlook for prices in Perth or something like that. Yeah. So what has really struck me is I can get lots of data down to a really fine-grained level. So I can actually start to talk about really localized things. What's life like on your street? Will your street go up in value? What kinds of properties will go up in value? So for me, it's like a merging of people's ordinary daily lives and science at this lower level. So it's really exciting to be on the MICROBURBS.
So you're saying it's a blend of art and science, because when you mention those suburbs, I think Cottesloe, lifestyle suburb, Glebe and Newtown, great. They're grungy, trendy, inner city Sydney suburbs. They're great, and people think they know everything about King Street, for example, but you can identify a much more granular kind of data, right?
That's right. Yeah. So we look at individual property purchases and sales. So that means that we can control for things like, did they do a renovation? So if you're going to go in as an investor and buy a property, you don't want to have to factor in the cost having to do a renovation like the neighbors are. And when you've got all of these pairs of properties being bought and sold, you have millions and millions of data points to learn from. So you can find way more. So a theme you'll find, I hope I can get this across, is that having lots of data allows you to do better science. Yeah. When you've only got a few data points, that's in the realm of analogy, and it may be true, but it doesn't have that provability that you can when you've got a very large amount of data. So for us, having every property since 1990 for the whole country, pretty much, to the degree that it was digitized, means that we can talk about a lot more stuff. Whereas if you're just looking at median prices on suburbs are very diverse places. You're having to draw a lot of inference yourself and bring in a whole lot of your own theories into things. So we have it more of a let's just prove it scientifically. And if we can't, we'll certainly provide the data to people so they can draw their own conclusions.
You're touching on a really good theme, and that is that a lot of property investors or property experts think they know about the market. They have a hunch, right? They've got a theory, as you say, but there's no way for them to validate that. What you're saying is MICROBURBS can actually, with that many data points you've got, you can actually validate and create a construct of an area and really drill into a suburb to pinpoint each individual property and its characteristics.
That's right. Yeah. So a local property expert, a buyer's agent or a seller's agent, they will have certain advantages in that they will know the talk on the street. They'll know what certain properties are going to go for or just went for, what kinds of buyers were in there. There's a certain flavor that they have, but a disadvantage is that they only know a small market, whereas our AI has seen the entire property market since 1990. So it's to what degree is this place special? And one way of thinking of it is like lookalikes, yeah? So there might be other suburbs on the other side of the country that have been through this before and are fitting into certain patterns. And so you can think of it as like this all-seeing, not necessarily all-knowing, but certainly seeing a lot of stuff across the country.
Are you saying that your product is omnipotent? You know?
No, there's lots of things that we don't know. So for example, if you wanted to know whether something is going to be subdivided, then you might want to like network with the local council or developers or something.
Love it. That's great. I guess just a negative thing that I often hear around the traps is some people are quite cynical about data analysts. They say they can't see the wood for the trees, or that too much data actually creates this thing called paralysis of analysis.
Yeah.
What do you say to those people that say that there's just too much data is bad?
I think it's very true if you are a human trying to digest it all. So there's a limit to how much we all can digest. That includes me.
Yep.
So you can end up with people that are looking at data, trying to confirm theories that they've already found. So they've looked at 5 data points, they've seen a pattern, and now anything new that comes along, either they will make it conform to that, or they'll have some excuse of why it doesn't. So sometimes it feels like you're down at the TAB, and people have they just know, they have a sense, and it's like. So yeah, you can definitely go down rabbit holes with data.
What do you call that bias? What is a certain name you give that when someone has a preconceived idea of what the outcome is going to be?
Confirmation bias.
Confirmation bias.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. So that's an absolute killer. So my approach is try and go always from first principles. So always go back to asking the biggest question. So it's not like I come up with a theory and then I come up with 10 ways where I can prove the theory. Obviously, you've got to illustrate.
Yeah.
But it's more like, okay, we are trying to predict, the biggest one is capital growth.
Yeah.
So go back to first principles, ask the question, what drives capital growth, and make sure this data is included in it, but keep in all the other data, because that other data might actually be better at finding the pattern, or it may qualify it. So it may say, okay, this applies only for supply constricted metro markets and not regional markets or something like that.
Okay, yeah, cool. You actually just touched on a really good point, capital growth. And in your experience, you're looking at data and millions of data points every day. What do you suggest are the key primary drivers of capital growth?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing is that as an asset class, real estate has performed well. So the overall, so since 1990, properties have gone up a lot. So that's a base. But obviously you want to do better than that though. A huge thing for us is that comes up over and over again. This is very reliable. So our models are all about what makes money in every single market in every year. Mostly every year, the suburbs that it picks, on average, they go up. They beat the market by a lot. So that includes during the GFC, during COVID, during the mining boom. So it's like an overall. What drives capital growth, and it's not like I come in and edit the model because I think that I have a personal opinion on work from home or something like that. So this kind of model, 2 big things that it finds. One is what's called mean reversion. So that is when a suburb has gone up a lot, it's going to fall back again relative to the national average. And I should mention, we're always trying to predict relative to the national average. So I'm not a macro guy. I just want to know how it's going to perform compared to everything else. I don't know what's going to happen in China with the shadow banking or whatever. You have suburbs overshoot and undershoot. There's a good time to buy in them. So you can see this over like a 5 to 10 year period and over shorter periods as well. So it depends on the situation. But yeah, you'll have lots of cases where a suburb has gone up like 2.5x in 5 years, and then it does nothing for the next 5 years. So mean reversion is a really big one. Another one is just a mispricing relative to other suburbs. So I'm partnered with Jeremy Shepherd of DSR Data on this, and he talks about what's called the ripple effect, which is, I believe, not his, but he's very famous for it. So what you can have is that a suburb gets really hot. You don't need that many buyers in a suburb to make it go up. So you only need a couple of buyers bidding on the one property to push prices up. Whereas if you've got 0 or 1 buyer, then it's a seller's market. So you have a small number of buyers moving around, chasing prices, and they don't organize with one another to spread themselves evenly across the country. And so you will often have that there is a suburb that has just been underpriced. So even though you might have a suburb that has more amenity, is more cool, and it goes up first, then you might have a forgotten suburb that's less of a brand name. Maybe not as many people search for it in realestate.com.au, but over time they'll come to it. Another aspect is that if there isn't transparency on pricing, then people might spend time in a market attending auctions. If they don't have a good buyer's agent like yourself that isn't managing expectations, then they could be like, we attend a whole lot and think, oh, geez, this is actually out of our budget. We've got to go further out. Or I haven't been able to talk down places like I thought, or the properties didn't end. We spent 3 weekends looking at properties, and the cheap ones actually had all these big shortcomings. So our dreams of before have gone. So you've got, a big difference in markets based on, so you can track them. So there are markets that are, if you think of it as like share trading, so there are markets that are highly correlated, and so this is called pair trading. So when one market diverges from another, then the models will often expect a correction. And there are markets that are inversely correlated as well, which is interesting.
Okay. Yeah. What about, some people say, population growth is a critical factor for suburb growth. Now, I disagree with that. I think it is a factor. You definitely need to have, it increases demand, but it all comes relative to supply.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, southwest Sydney, there's huge tracts of land around Leppington, Austral, for example, that are all being developed now. Now, the zonings will allow for that. But you pick an area like Mossman or Bondi, for example, there's not a lot of greenfield land to do lots of subdivisions, right?
Yeah.
So I think, it's not just one factor in isolation.
That's right.
And I think the other factors we often quote in our business is employment growth and infrastructure. So new infrastructure like a new train line, a major hospital, new schools, any kind of new education facilities. They are all big drive, particularly hospital precincts. I think medical precincts attract a lot of really highly qualified staff and medical professionals, which increases, I think, demand in that area. Doesn't mean all the doctors want to live in Westmead, for example. But what do you think about those sort of factors as drivers of capital growth?
So I guess the biggest rookie mistake is to look at previous population growth, because if the population's already moved in, they got housed. Yeah? They're already there. So are you then making a call that you're expecting there to be a momentum that is more population because other population has come in? So that may not be the case. And then, yes, broadly, I think what you're saying is it always matters supply and demand. So infrastructure can increase demand. So it can be all very well to have a new train line put in, and there's probably some figure to put to how many more people would want to live there as a result of that. How easily could you sell units at a profit? How many more units could you sell at a profit given a metro line in there? But you always have to ask, well, how many units are there going to be? You could still overshoot. And infrastructure tends to be tied to supply. So I understand there's a proposal out by the Young Liberals here in New South Wales, and they want to make it that near every train station there's unlimited density. So, and it makes sense. So there's definitely logic to it, but it's like you have to take that into account. These things are complicated, and infrastructure also is complicated because when do you take when does the price go up? So is it on the rumor? Is it on the plan? Is it when it starts to be built? So you need to have some expertise to know when has the price been realized. So if maybe people have already bought in, or fully expecting that it's been fully priced in this new infrastructure, and it's just silly people who buy from then on in.
Just on that point alone, that's a really good point you raised, because infrastructure is a big driver, in my view, of capital growth, but infrastructure doesn't always get built. So I reckon there's definitely a mini spike when it's announced, there's definitely people buy in on the anticipation. It's like sort of almost a trading bet. I believe that this train line or this tunnel or whatever is going to happen. Like say the Northern Beaches Tunnel, for example. It was announced, the previous Liberal governments, it's going to go ahead. They did the drilling, and then the Labor government got in and said, we're ditching that for indefinitely. But the biggest spike happens, I reckon, just before it's completed. People realise that there's going to be travel savings times. I mean, Baulkham Hills, for example, you remember the M2 was built back in, I can't remember what year it was, but I remember median prices jumped about 30% the year after it opened because suddenly it knocked 15 minutes travel time off into the city. It was amazing. Suddenly made it a much more accessible area. So I think you're right, but you've got to make sure the infrastructure is actually going to get built. And at the moment, I think the government's paring back quite a bit of infrastructure because they just can't afford it and they want to keep their surplus.
Yeah, there are two levels of benefiting from infrastructure. So one is just being in a house that now is quicker to get into town. Another one is if it's your land that the infrastructure is going to get built on. So what does that look like? Does that mean, or it's really close to the infrastructure? So if you can anticipate a change in zoning, so if you have a home where a station is going to be built and suddenly you can fit way more people for the land, then you're going to get that's a more surefire bet of growth, and you might have people come out of the woodwork who listen to a spruiker that are knocking on your door trying to buy an option for your property. That's a pretty good sign that things are going to go up.
Sure. Just back to capital growth, I guess amenity and lifestyle seem to be, in my mind, key drivers. Is that something you can measure, and do you believe that's a key component of capital growth?
So it's a work in progress. It definitely determines the value. Obviously, you can just look at prices and see that they're higher where there is amenity and where there's not. There's definitely things going on there. So there's things like demographics and the kinds of, I've been finding the kinds of businesses that crop up and also what's in their balance sheets actually are predictors of capital growth. So yes, I think it is a good thing to understand, and it's going to bit of watch this space in terms of how it influences capital growth. It's not as straightforward as you might think.
No, exactly. I mean, even in the paper today, there was an article about a property in the eastern suburbs that sold for $9 million more than the one next door because the one next door had a view of the Opera House, and it's saying what price is a view. And the Opera House is obviously iconic. And, there's no exact science, but definitely people are willing to pay more, the WTP analogy, phenomenon, for really high amenity. So I think that's definitely a factor, but it's not the only factor. So
it's always supply and demand, really, isn't it? Exactly. So there's a limited number of properties that can see the Opera House. So if there was a way, if we built a big dome around the Opera House and everyone could see it, then it'd be a different story. But those sort of iconic views are limited, and so you can expect that. And if you can identify things that will be in short supply, continue to be in short supply in the future, then expect some capital growth.
That's a great point. We'll come back to that. Tell me about the mistakes that people make, or the least important factors for capital growth. So what are the least important factors? In other words, what do some investors just get too hung up on that they shouldn't bother about?
I think there's a kind of lazy approach as an investor where you think of it as just a couple of black and white choices. So you just go, okay, regional versus metro, and then, okay, it's Brisbane versus Sydney. And then you go, okay, and now I have this much to afford, so I'm going to go to the western suburbs to buy. The big thing doing all this data analysis is you learn that there are many ways to make money in real estate. There are many different approaches. And I think if you just go too high level, then you're taking, if it's not backed by local knowledge or fine-grained data, preferably they're both working together, then you're not going to make money. So you don't think of it as like, I can understand from the point of view of an investor just talking at dinner parties and barbecues. It's like, should I invest in the country or the city? Should I go out of Sydney versus inner city? So overall, metro has outperformed regional, but there have been amazing regional growths, like absolute blow away regional growth. So it's a bit like the city is a bit like eBay, so it's more commodified, so that one suburb is more correlated to the next, and regional Australia is more like a garage sale. So you just don't know what bargains you're going to pick up. And it may be that something is really mispriced. So on the one hand, someone might say, oh, this is a lovely town. We don't want to sell to any outsiders. I'm very attached to this thing. And so it's overpriced. But then on the other hand, it may simply be, oh, it's junk. And they don't know what it's worth.
Yeah.
So it's like, there are all kinds of ways. So I just, when people ask me, should it be one or the other, this kind of black and white thinking, and I'm like, well, I go bottom up. So if I can look at every property I can, or every suburb, and there's a whole lot of factors going on. And so I guess it's more of an overall philosophy of thinking, and then the kinds of data points you look for that arise from that.
I think you're right. I think some investors shouldn't have such a black and white view of it's got to be option A or B. I think there's a role for regional and there's a role for metro, and you can make money in both. It is also a question of how much money you want to make and what's the long-term exit strategy. So I'm always advising my clients, if you're buying into a market now, particularly if, say, a regional area, it might be fantastically hot now for a certain reason. But in 10 years' time, when COVID's a distant memory, or the gold mines closed down, or that agriculture's been replaced by something else, will that town still have the same kind of supply-demand equation in the future versus something that's been tried and tested for 100 years?
The more remote it is, the more volatile the market is.
Yeah, so it's kind of like those penny stocks, they can fly up in a minute, but they could also come back.
That's right. Yeah.
So let's talk about median prices, Luke. And again, this is one of my hobby horses. I know it's one of yours. Do you think that median price is an accurate measure of the real market price of a property in a suburb? Tell me why not do you think that?
Yeah, so the median is just the middle point out of all the sales. So a simple way of calculating it is what have been the sales over a given period and what's the middle property. But at opposite ends of the spectrum, you're going to get different kinds of properties. So you'll have the really low-end ones, the really high-end ones, and you think, okay, yep, middle, that sounds fine. But the problem is that markets aren't perfect little distributions from high to low. So a classic example might be if you have a suburb that's got, let's say you've got all of these 1970s walk-up homes, and they cost 500 grand each. And then they come in and build some beautiful Meriton homes, and they cost $1 million each, Now let's imagine there's 40% Meriton homes and 60% walk-ups. That it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be the exact same number of new homes versus old homes selling at any point. And what you can see on a raw graph is that it just keeps on jumping up and down between two types. You see it all the time in the raw data. And it's like, no, you have to understand that there is a broader context to the market. Too few properties are sold at any given point in time. Another problem with median prices is that different kinds of properties sell in different markets. So the low end of the market, the bottom 20%, sells pretty reliably in any market. But as you go for the higher end, it's harder to move high-end merchandise. So this is similar to a concept in other markets of a floor price, So if you're selling a house at the floor price, there's always going to be someone who will take it, So they'll come from maybe they'll come from a cheaper suburb, but they're like, oh, wow, I can be a bit closer to town and I can get that. Or maybe it's someone who would have normally bought a mid-level property, but because of economic conditions, they just want a base level. It may be in the tougher economic times, people are prepared to buy a lower quality building and then add to it later. Whereas if they're feeling more optimistic, they might buy a beautiful new home like this one. So that's another problem. And then so these problems lead the existing players to just drag it out over a longer period so they can make these nice smooth curves. But for us at MICROBURBS, our only customer is the buyer and the buyer's agent. So we don't have other kinds of people to deal with. So we're much more into just like, let's find the price that's most reflective of current conditions.
So what's your method? How do you measure? What's the best method of measuring price in a suburb?
Yeah, so one is to do this hedonic adjustment, which we do. So that is like accounting for the kinds of properties that are sold now. But the other is to use machine learning. So to look at what's going on in the rest of the market to ask, what would the median price be if there was enough volume? So the existing players, they just go, oh, not enough volume. I'm either not going to give you an answer at all, so we don't tell you about 2-bedroom homes in Forestville, or they just make the curve really smooth. So they're including prices from 12 months ago. So we don't do that. We're about, okay, we'll find the best price. What is the most reflective price right now, even if the curve looks a bit funny, even if it looks like it jumps up and down. So my research has found that even after 2 weeks, so looking at properties, pairs of properties that are bought and sold in the same time periods, really close to one another, the markets break down within about they start to decorrelate after 2 weeks. So we're doing a monthly, which is still pretty good. And then the other part of it is coming back to that representation of the housing stock. It's really important to break it down. So if you want to have the high quartile and bottom quartile, so the top, the top quartile might be the homes that have been built in the past 10 years. Obviously, they're going to be it'll be a different kind of market to someone at the bottom quartile. So we provide those, and also we provide by number of bedrooms, which is achieving a similar aim.
That's so important. I mean, I get so frustrated with median prices. I find them incredibly misleading because you talk about the diversity of property stock, 2-bedroom units to even 3-bedroom units plus studies versus a 2-bedroom house to a 5-bedroom house. And, in a suburb, the median might be 2.1, but it's very difficult to buy a decent house for 2.1. You need to be spending 2.8, 2.7, whatever, to actually buy something decent. So unfortunately, a lot of people that are a bit green or haven't been looking think, oh, you're a buyer's agent, you're a miracle worker, you can buy me a 6-bedroom house for 2.1. Sorry, we can't. We're about 10 years too late,
As if it's like a recommended retail price.
Yeah, exactly.
As if the government says, you shouldn't pay more than this.
That's right. So you're absolutely right. So doing a stratified median, actually looking at the individual property types and what kind of median price applies to that property type. And then I know within your program too, you've also got the ability to look at different areas within a suburb and a breakdown of medians within an area of a suburb, because we know that there's so-called golden triangles within a suburb, or streets closer to the shops, or to a bus or a train connection there, or a quieter part of the suburb right away from the main road. They're better, So people
are almost always surprised when they see. So as you guys are delivering with these reports, when you show this to the buyer's agents already know this stuff, but when you show it to a punter, they're amazed. Oh, wow, it really is different. There's a massive difference in price.
And this comes down to that local knowledge, combining both art and science. What I'm saying? It's the art. I mean, our buyer's agents are all local specialists. They know the market, they know the agents, they know the streets, all that sort of thing. But to be able to back it up with that kind of data, I think that's a very, very powerful story.
So people can understand that the life on the main road in a unit is very different to the life down the road by the bush. Very different kind of person lives there.
Exactly.
The people by the bush, it's going to be more of an independent home. Whereas the people by the unit on the main road, they're going to be much more dependent on amenity.
Let's talk about property supply. We've talked a bit about demand drivers. Let's talk about supply. What are some good ways that you reckon we can measure supply of property in a suburb or a region?
So there's many different levels. So I break up supply based on how far into the future. So one thing, there's current supply, so the number of listings available. So you can look at the number of months of inventory to sell the property. So if there's given how long it takes in a usual month to sell all the merchandise, if you have a lot of inventory on the market and will take a long time, then that's a bad sign for the short-term price of the market. There are things like, also we found house-to-unit ratios. So when houses get too expensive, people move to units, and there's many things else going on, but there is some bleed from one to the other. So that's one thing. Then you've got coming supply. So things like what's on the horizon, so DAs and the primary market. So if it's new builds or people are building villas and things. Then you've got potential supply. So that's like, what does the government let you do given the land that's there? So what could people put in if they wanted to? So that comes down to zoning things like floor space ratio, how big can they build, minimum lot size to subdivide, height of buildings. So that is something, if people can actually, of their own volition, add to the supply, that's something to know about. It may be okay if you're going to be the person who does that, but yeah. Then there's future supply, so things like land release and growth zones, so the bigger plans that the government has. And then there's like other strategic things like we talked about before with infrastructure. So you mentioned, was it Borkham Hills, where new infrastructure is coming in, and you just know that governments like to put new homes where the infrastructure is going to be.
Excellent. There's a lot of good suggestions there. I think, Core Logic, they put out sort of two measures. There's new listings and total listings. And total listings, which combines new and old listings together, is about, on Australia-wide, it's down about 19 to 20%, the 5-year average. So, but that's just an average, across the, but it shows that listings are tight. People seem to be holding on to their properties longer.
An associated metric of days on market.
Yes.
So how quickly is the merchandise being moved? Obviously, if it's sticking around for a long time, then even though the vendors probably want to sell, then that's a sign that it's a slow market. Buyers have lots of choice, and they have the ability to talk down price.
So let's talk about how can investors use that sort of data point to avoid buying in areas that could become oversupplied or are oversupplied in the future.
So months of inventory. I guess this is my bias here, but I throw it all into an algorithm.
Okay.
So it's like, I don't do it manually myself. So there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So I'll focus on what I can scientifically prove.
Perfect. Yeah. Okay. Anecdotally, I look at certain areas like the Ripley Valley, which is west of Ipswich. A lot of land out there. A lot of the infrastructure is not in place yet, but it could be. So that's an area that potentially could be oversupplied in the future. Again, the southwest of Sydney, I won't say it's oversupplied, but there is a lot of land to be released. So what I'm saying is that it's an area that I think will have very low to moderate price growth, not high price growth. And as an investor, I want high price growth. I want to buy in suburbs that's very tightly held, where there's low days on market, where there's very limited inventory stock, where it does sell quickly, where there's a high proportion of owner-occupier to investors and units. They're the kind of tightly, where the controls by the council are very tight. They're the kind of areas for me that I recommend our investors buy, because you're not suddenly going to see, blocks and blocks of Meriton apartments with 300 per tower being built there. Yeah,
so for this reason, units are more dangerous. So I was looking yesterday at what have been the times where investors have made the most money collectively and where they've made the least. And there are lots of times where it's just a whole lot of units come onto the market all the same time, and they make eye-watering losses. They all sell at the same time.
Ouch.
And with units, obviously the ability to just add more, subject to government, so that you can meet the demand more easily with units. And obviously also you're getting less land, and land is the thing that's truly valuable. That makes houses in general a better bet.
Cool. This is more a general question, but I'd like to discuss the interpretation of your property data that you've got. How should savvy investors and home buyers use the data that you can provide to their advantage to make a better property decision?
Yeah, so you want to take emotion out of it too much. You don't want to be just taken by a few things that resonate with you, because try and imagine that you're told a couple of things at a barbecue by your mate who did well last year in the property market, and someone else has been told the same thing by another mate who has the exact opposite thing. Go for the coast, go for inland. Just understand that you have a more limited view. Another thing would be don't follow all the trends. So if everyone is touting Gladstone as the place to get in, then that's probably a bad sign. It probably is going to go up too much. There's too much in there. There may be limited supply. And then, broadly speaking, you want to, for me, I try and find the most universally proven data. So we do back testing back to 1990. It's over the whole country. It's as fine-grained as we possibly can. So there's a distinction between the data point, which is persuasive, and then a more scientific view where it's like, hey, we can prove this stuff works. So the more you can do the science, the less you're sort of going by instincts. I mean, you may well have good instincts. It could be you could be right on the money with something, but you probably don't have the same level of instinct as a property professional who's been in the game for a long time, or someone who's been analyzing the data for a very long time, or better still, both working together.
Perfect. Yeah, cool. Now, Luke, COVID brought quite a few changes to our property market, and we had lots of dire predictions about everything, but it did bring a few significant changes in the property market. What permanent changes do you think COVID might have brought about into the property market?
Yeah, so we saw the regions go up a lot with COVID. I'll be interested to hear your view as well. And I understand that searches for things like home offices and pools and yards, so outdoor space, became more popular. And I think COVID is one of these things that where it was exacerbating existing trends. So obviously it was already technologically much more easy to work from home. The home can be more of an independent thing as you've got home delivery and home theaters instead of going to the movies. So yeah, I'd be interested to hear what you found.
Yeah, interesting you meant about the people fleeing to the regions. There was a survey done this year of about 5,000 people that actually moved out of all the capital cities to the regions. And they asked them, after 2 years, how's life? Are you thinking about moving back? About 50% said they actually made a bad choice and they want to move back. And about 35% had already moved back for whatever reason. And I think it's because of social dislocation. In other words, if you're moving away from an established social network of family, friends, connections, and your sports club and all that, you're going to miss it. And I think people really didn't understand just how much they valued that community.
Yeah.
So you're probably going to see about at least half of those that moved out come back. So the tide's gone out, the tide's come back in. Not all of it's come back in. I think some people I know myself who've personally moved to Newcastle or Gold Coast or Sunny Coast, and they love it, and that's great. But there was a bit of regional regret. I think the other major change that's permanent is a hybrid working from home. I don't think it's ever going to go back to 5 days a week at the office. I'm seeing it to being between 3 to 4 days in the office and usually 1 day a week from home. That's the kind of thing I'm seeing because it gives people more work-life balance. We've all got to pay bills and get washing done, and you can do it in between a few phone calls, whatever.
Yeah.
Your employer still expects you to get the work done. And I know a lot of my team can be just as effective at home as at the office, but you do miss the collaboration, and you do need that collaboration in an office environment. So I think there's some interesting changes that I think are going to be permanent there.
Yeah. So on that life quality friendship thing, so it's harder to meet people these days. People don't talk to one another in the street as much. There's way fewer volunteer organizations. So things like Rotary have passed from previous generations. Sport is about all that's left in terms of volunteer organizations. We used to be a great nation of belonging to all kinds of those sort of things, the Women's Auxiliary and the church and all of that. And there's some amazing stats out of America about how people are losing, they have fewer friends, and the proportion of men who now say they have no friends, and it's happening for women as well. Just yesterday, you have to verify this one, but I saw that apparently there was a study that found that people used to spend 60 minutes a day with friends, and then 20 years later, it's down to 20 minutes.
Wow.
So I think people we're in a world of distraction by screens, and I think we probably do undervalue our friends. Absolutely. And underestimate how hard it is to make new, genuine friendships, particularly as you get older. So
you've got to be intentional about it. That's the key message there. Yeah. So Luke, when you're looking to invest in property, what are the first steps that you'd recommend an investor take when researching where to buy?
Yeah, so obviously, very first thing would be to know your budget. So that'd be the very first. So
go to a broker, work out your budget.
Yep, that's it, and stick within that. And then obviously know how much cash flow there's going to be. Obviously this is an area you would deal with all the time. I'm interested in your view on this one.
Yeah, well, some of the thing, it's first thing we do is look at the needs and objectives of the client. We say to the client, what's your purpose in investing in property? Is it to create more of a bias for capital growth, or do you need cash flow? Do you need high yield? Depending on their income, because someone on 70 grand a year is going to struggle to buy a high negatively geared property. If they don't want to be forking out, $500 a week to hang onto a property. So we've got to provide a tailored solution for each client. But we'll sit down with the client, do a fact find, work out their borrowing capacity. If they don't have finance, we'll recommend them to speak to a finance broker. And then we go through a strategy chat, a strategy discussion around what their long-term goals are. And then from there, if their borrowing capacity is, say, $1 million, we'll identify what locations we think will be best to meet their need. And there's no one size fits all. It might be that they can buy a property in Western Sydney, or if they need to get something with a higher growth, it might be they need to buy in Brisbane, for example, or in a regional area. So if they want to add value and do a granny flat, or they want to actually do a subdivision, or even higher scale, they want to do 3 townhouses. So we sit down and really take those steps. And then in terms of location, it depends also where they have other properties. It's really important to consider diversification. Also consider land tax issues. If you've got 4 properties in Melbourne, it's probably time to think about buying in other states, because all the governments, just after they've increased their land tax rates. So, so it's an initial, fact find and discussion like that. So, talking about location again, how much importance do you place on choosing the right type of property? In other words, how do you decide whether you go for a house, a unit, terrace, townhouse, that sort of thing?
So unit versus house, we actually think of them as different markets. So always in our data, we never put them together. So a unit market in a given suburb will correlate to a unit market a couple of kilometres down the road, much more than it will the local house market. So it's a different kind of person. Even the stratifying individual house markets is a worthwhile endeavour. So they're different markets. They have different forecasts. We have different reports for them. So and then in between, so if you think of obviously it gets more and more unit, the more high density it is. So the more you're talking about a commodified asset. So it gets a lot easier to price something when there's been something extremely similar sold every other month. And then on the other hand, you've got houses, particularly if they're on large blocks, and it becomes, so on that end of the spectrum, it's much more about the land. So broadly speaking, like we've said, you're better off buying land because land goes up, and you've got to be very careful to understand with a unit how much are you really buying of that land. And then in between, so you've got your terraces and townhouses. So an important distinction there is strata versus Torrens title. Do they use Torrens title all across the country? I know it came out of South Australia.
They
use
do,
it here.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
do use Torrens.
Yeah. So
some
the term.
Some townhouses can be strata and some can be Torrens.
Yes, when you call it a townhouse. So so obviously a terrace is better than a strata townhouse because you've got the Torrens title, you've got complete control. It's not divided up. You don't have to answer to a body corporate. You don't have a tragedy of the commons when no one agrees to update stuff. But townhouses and villas, I haven't done the research in a while, but I remember a while ago finding that they did fine as long as they were in good, convenient areas. So they behaved a bit more like houses than units where there was convenience. But I don't know so much about if
I think that's a good summary answer, because I've found that townhouses are a great compromise between a unit and a house. Often the budget precludes a client from buying a house because they simply can't afford it. If they need 2.5 to get into an area, but they've got 1.5, then rather than buying a unit, if they can get in with a townhouse or a terrace, it's a great compromise.
Absolutely, yeah. So a big thing about a house that people might not consider is how much is it going to cost to maintain it.
Yeah.
So are you at a level, it's more your high income people who think this way, but it's like, do you value your own time? What do you rate it at? Yeah. Is it going to be every second Saturday you're going to have to maintain the front just to keep up with the Joneses? Yeah. Otherwise you feel guilty every time you pull out of the driveway.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or are you going to pay for a gardener if you're higher end enough, and that you can put that in as a cost. Yep. So
exactly.
Though having maintaining a couple of pot plants and a bit of a paint job on a terrace is a much more easy proposition, and maybe if you've got a good career, maybe you're better off spending those extra hours on that rather than maintaining a property. Certainly if you're a geek like me who doesn't ever feel the urge to mow a lawn.
There you go. Actually, we're talking of incomes. You raise a good point, because there's a lot of argument about incomes not keeping pace with property prices. what property types do you think will be in the highest demand over the next 10 years?
Yeah, so the current environment, I mean, the big standout thing is very high levels of immigration. So 500,000 people a year. And it's very clear in the data that migrants have different property preferences, particularly non-European, non-Northern Western European migrants. They're much more about amenity. They're much more about convenience, proximity to work, whereas your Anglos and your Indigenous people and your Western Europeans and like second and third generation Australians are much more about space, privacy, quiet. Yeah, so if you have a huge influx of migrants, they have to go somewhere. They can't afford to go buy a house. They can't afford to go buy anything. So what are they going to do? They're going to rent a unit. They're okay with units. Overseas, much more people live in high density accommodation when they're in the city, particularly in Asia.
Yeah.
So the demand definitely has to be there for higher density, and the planning, particularly in Sydney, is where there's limited land. You're going to have it grow up. So that's on the demand side, but you still have to have caution because can the governments meet the supply is the other question. So if they can, so from a point of view of capital growth, if you think that later down the track they will meet the supply, then the unit may still be not that great a proposition. Having said that, there are times, like every market can do well. So if you can, like there are certain units that have done well in like established suburbs where they've just had a ban. So the NIMBYs take over and they have a ban on building any new units, and you can see amazing growth in them. But yeah, just be really mindful of supply, even though there may be demand.
Yeah, I think that higher demand or higher income people will always demand the houses because they want that for their kids in the leafy burbs. I think that will always be a really strong demand for that. But equally, with incomes not keeping up with property prices, it's going to be harder to save for younger people to deposits.
Absolutely.
So I think affordability is definitely going to drive high demand for apartments and townhouses. And again, I think it's just going to be a continuing relativity. But I do think there's going to be a greater proportion of people that are going to end up renting. I mean, about 30% of the population rent, 30% pay off a mortgage, and 30% own their home outright. So I think you're going to find that there'll be a high proportion of renters. So my message to anyone listening is if you can afford to buy a property, get in as soon as you can and enjoy the capital growth ride. If you can.
Yeah, it's really interesting looking at data about younger generations. So there was a survey in America that found that half of millennials said their ideal relationship was a non-monogamous one. That blew my mind. And even more among Gen Zs. So they have a much more fluid idea of where they're going to be.
Interesting.
They're not told that they have a job for life. So that kind of lifestyle will lead to them making renting more attractive. And you have a more mobile middle class today, people taking jobs in other countries. Back in the day, it would only be the very high-end expats. But now you can just go to a new country as a junior. If you've got a degree, especially, do a gap year, a working gap year in London, and not even just be working pubs, but actually starting your career. So this mobility does lead to, obviously, a rental market is ever more attractive.
Perfect. Luke, I've got a couple more questions for you. Just to briefly, prop tech and AI, they're two things dear to your heart. What are you putting into your business to keep up with technology and using AI?
Yeah, so the new developments in AI, it's really exciting for us because we've got a ridiculously large database. So we've got billions of data points. And it's always the challenge, how do you get the right data point out to the right person at the right time? What do they need? So we have a website filled with 5,000 of these fields, and it's longitudinal, but there's this challenge of like, how do we, I can't sit down with all of them and run through every single problem they have. So for us with our new product suite, it's very much about identify the markets, type to them, chat to them automatically with AI, get them to the answer they want, surface the data points that they in particular need. So there's a great ability to expand the functionality of products. That's one thing. I've talked also about forecasting. So the ability, when you've got lots of data, to look back in time and backtest and say, would this really have, this model, it made this prediction at this time, let's see if it really did. So similar to you, an expert, you've got a track record, you're well respected in the industry, you've made all of these predictions in the past. This is true for the AI as well. We can simulate what it would have done if it was around making predictions in 1995. So it's one thing to look back on the past and draw conclusions. Cities are great because they've performed well in the past 2 years or whatever. And then the opposite happens, yeah? So the forecasting is really exciting. And also inference. So this is not looking at the future, but just being able to get more fine-grained. So for example, we have much more fine-grained crime maps coming out, looking at hyper-local areas. So this is the part of this mission of microburbs, to be really hyper-local. And also up-to-date. So if the government hasn't put out data since 2019, but people want it today, mortgage stress is a classic example. So we've updated our mortgage stress data because we've got other data sets that can help inform this. So you can train the AI to be like, okay, given the data that you knew in the past, this is what the outcome has been. You've got all this more recent data. Now tell us what this level would be today. And then more broadly speaking, there's just more vibe, I would say, in the AI these days. It has more of a sense of things. It's certainly not at the level of being able to describe the intricacies of a street or even your average suburb in great detail, but it's getting a lot more human. And for me as a data scientist, it's very exciting to be able to use these categorizations. So for example, you find that a certain type of suburb did well over a period, and then you can just ask the AI, what's the vibe of this? And they'll say, it was these 4 factors these suburbs have in common. Is really exciting.
Love it. Fantastic. I'm going to jump straight to your personal involvement in property. What's been your best property investment you've made so far?
Yeah, so here I'm a bit weird as well, in that I'm actually an entrepreneur. That's my job. So my big thing is to put money into my businesses. So I got into microburbs, goes back to 2014, but my big goal was to do well with microburbs. So for me, my calculation is I put $1 in and I should be able to get 10x or 100x out of that rather than real estate. And the more that I do that, the less I'm beholden to short-term needs. So the short-term, we don't need to sell a certain amount in a given month. We don't have to I don't have to be as beholden to investors. So I mean, I own we've always owned homes, and we've done well out of that. So I'm a homeowner. I'm not completely averse to it. And also partnered with Jeremy Shepherd, who is an absolute seasoned property investor. So there's a huge amount of learnings from that.
Awesome. And do you have an outlook for the property market in 2024? What do you think is going to look happen next year?
Yeah, I mean, the big thing, 500,000 more people coming into the country, that's really strong. So they've got to go somewhere. So it's hard to imagine prices going down. It will vary. So it's every single market, every single year we find some places go up a lot and other places go down a lot. So you definitely still need to pick, but I can't see any near-term problems with the property market. Even though you've got affordability issues and it's a lot of income in order to buy, it's just, once again, supply and demand. So what are the most, I guess it's the overall theme of the podcast is like, what are the most important things in both supply and demand? You need both to be able to answer that, and just way more demand coming in.
Perfect. And finally, what's your best property tip that you could share with our audience today?
Yeah, so never stop thinking about supply and demand. Never think about one without the other. Focus on the big things. Focus on the main things. Focus on things that you can rely on over time, preferably as much as possible an indicator that works in isolation. If you don't need a complicated array of different factors, And I guess one last thing, don't buy mining towns. They're terrible.
I love that bit of advice, mate. Well done. Now, if people want to find out more about Luke Metcalfe, microburbs.com.au, is that where they can go?
Microburbs.com.au, absolutely. We've got a whole lot of fine-grained data, and we've got investor suburb reports as well, with loads of, we've got forecasts and loads of fine-grained deep dives as well.
Wonderful. Well, Luke Metcalfe, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and infinite data points with us today. Really appreciate having you on the show.
It's been an absolute pleasure, Rich. Thank you very much.
Thanks again. Thanks for being with us on another Property Buyer podcast. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please click on the SpeakPipe link and we'll answer this during the next episode. If you're looking to buy a residential or commercial property in the near future and would like to get the added advantage of having a buyer's advocate on your side, then please reach out to my team today and send us your inquiry, and we'd be delighted to help. Please visit our website at propertybuyer.com.au, where you can stay updated with all my latest market updates, weekly blogs and live suburb profiles to help you make better property decisions. We look forward to connecting with you again on the next Property Buyer podcast.